A blind retired Navy SEAL named Ethan Caldwell was alone in his old white farmhouse in White Pine Hollow, Vermont, when he heard weak scratching outside his porch during a snowstorm. He opened the door with his cane in one hand and found a starving German shepherd trembling in the snow. When the dog lifted his scarred face and licked Ethan's tears, the old soldier nearly collapsed. It was Ranger, his canine partner declared dead 3 years ago in the mission that took Ethan's sight and killed his closest brother-in-arms. Ethan thought God had only sent his dog home to heal his broken heart. But the wounds on Ranger's body, the hidden military tag under his skin, and the way he pulled toward an abandoned red barn would expose a betrayal buried beneath years of lies. What happened next changed the whole town. If you believe God can bring hope back through a loyal dog, subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. What city are you watching from? Comment below. Snow fell over White Pine Hollow like the whole town had been tucked beneath a white sheet. It covered the pine trees, the fence posts, the empty road, and the old white farmhouse at the edge of the woods. By nightfall, the porch steps had disappeared. Only one thing still stood upright beside the front door. A white cane with a red tip, leaning against the wall like a quiet reminder of the man inside. Ethan Caldwell lived alone in that house. Most people in White Pine Hollow knew his name, but almost nobody really knew him. They knew he was 46 years old. They knew he had once been a Navy SEAL. They knew he wore the same faded dark green military jacket every winter, the one with a worn U.S. Navy SEAL patch stitched onto the shoulder. And they knew he was blind. What they did not know was how much of him had stayed behind in the mission that took his sight. Ethan was a broad-shouldered white American man with short dark hair turning gray at the temples, a rough beard that never looked fully trimmed, and a face that seemed built from old weather and quiet pain. He moved carefully now. Not weakly, never weakly, but with the controlled patience of a man who had learned every inch of his home by touch. His left hand knew the edge of the kitchen table. His right hand knew the crack in the wooden hallway wall. His boots knew the uneven board near the fireplace. His cane knew the porch steps better than most men knew their own heartbeat. Before the injury, Ethan had been the kind of man people followed without needing an order. Calm under pressure, fast when danger came, gentle only when nobody was watching. But after the explosion overseas, after the hospital rooms, after the folded flag on his best friend's coffin, Ethan had stopped being a man people followed. He became a man people whispered about. They said he did not like visitors. They said he barely spoke. They said every winter made him worse. They were not entirely wrong. Inside the farmhouse, the fire was low. A cast-iron stove glowed red in the corner of the living room, pushing warmth into a room full of old things Ethan refused to throw away. A rocking chair sat near the window. A stack of firewood leaned beside the stove. A small wooden shelf held 3 framed photographs turned face down. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of black coffee he had forgotten to drink. The storm pressed against the house. Wind dragged snow across the windows. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter knocked once, then stopped. Ethan turned his head toward the sound. He listened. That was what he did now. He listened to the world the way other men looked at it. The farmhouse had its own language. The roof creaked when the temperature dropped. The porch boards moaned when ice settled under them. The old maple outside the kitchen window scraped the siding only when the wind came from the north. But this sound was different. It came softly. Scratch. Then nothing. Ethan stayed still. His fingers tightened around the mug. A few seconds passed. Scratch. This time it came from the front porch. Not the shutter, not the maple tree, not ice falling from the gutter. Something small, or something weak, was touching the door. Ethan stood slowly, His chair legs dragged against the floor. He reached for the cane by instinct, though inside the house he did not always need it. The white cane tapped once against the floorboards, then again. He moved through the living room, past the old military jacket hanging from a peg, past the shelf with the face-down photographs, toward the front door. Halfway there, he stopped. There was another sound now. Breathing. Faint, uneven, almost buried beneath the wind. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew the sound of a living thing trying not to die. He had heard it in deserts, in mountains, in helicopters, in field hospitals, and in places no prayer ever seemed loud enough to reach. He reached the door and touched the deadbolt. For 1 second, he did not open it. White Pine Hollow was a quiet place, but quiet places still had danger. Ethan knew that better than most. 3 years of blindness had not softened his instincts. They had sharpened them in other ways. He listened again. The breathing came closer to the bottom of the door. Then a soft whimper slipped through the wood. Ethan unlocked the door. The storm rushed in like a living animal. Cold slammed into his face. Snow touched his beard. Wind pushed at his chest. He held the door with one hand and his cane with the other. "Who's there?" he asked. No answer came, only the storm. Then something moved near his boots. Ethan lowered the cane, not striking, only searching. The tip brushed snow, then the edge of the porch mat, then something wet and warm. A body. An animal. A dog. The dog flinched but did not run. Ethan slowly set the cane aside and lowered himself to one knee. Snow soaked through the denim at once. He held out one hand, palm open. "It's all right," he whispered. "I won't hurt you." The dog took one broken step forward. Ethan heard claws scrape against the porch boards. Then a cold nose touched his palm. The touch was weak, but it went through him like lightning. Ethan froze. The dog's muzzle was narrow. The fur was soaked. The skin beneath it felt too close to the bone. Ethan moved his hand carefully along the dog's face, feeling the sharp line of the cheek, the trembling jaw, the old scars hidden beneath wet fur. A German shepherd. Old enough to have gray around the muzzle. Starved, badly. Shaking so hard its teeth clicked. Ethan swallowed. "You poor thing," he said. The dog leaned forward. Then it licked his hand. Once, twice, slowly. Not like a stray begging for food, like a dog greeting someone it had crossed the world to find. Ethan's hand started to tremble. He touched the dog's right ear. There it was, a torn fold near the top, a scar shaped like a crescent. His breathing stopped. No, it could not be. Ethan moved his hand down the dog's neck. His fingers found an old groove in the fur where a working collar had once sat for years. Then he touched the left shoulder, searching, praying he would not find what he already knew was there. A raised line of scar tissue, long, crooked, made by shrapnel years ago. Ethan's face broke. "No," he whispered. The dog pressed its head into his chest. Ethan put both hands on the animal's face. He felt the shape of the skull, the scar near the ear, the uneven breath, the way the dog leaned harder into his left side, exactly the way one dog had always done after long patrols. One dog. Only one. "Ranger?" The German shepherd made a sound so small it almost vanished in the storm. Then he lifted his wounded head and licked Ethan's face. Ethan collapsed fully onto both knees. The name came out of him like something torn open. "Ranger." The dog pushed forward, weak legs sliding on the snowy porch, and buried his face against Ethan's neck. Ethan wrapped his arms around him. He did not care about the snow. He did not care about the cold. He did not care that anyone driving past could see a retired Navy SEAL kneeling on his porch, crying into the fur of a starving dog. Ranger had been declared dead 3 years ago. Not missing, not lost. Dead. The report had said he died in the same blast that took Ethan's sight and killed Sergeant Luke Bennett, Ethan's closest brother-in-arms. Luke had been 38, tall, broad, with sandy hair, a loud laugh, and the kind of courage that made younger men feel ashamed of their own fear. He had been the man who could make coffee in a war zone and still joke that it needed more sugar. Ethan had heard Luke die. He had not seen it. He had heard the blast, the metal, the screaming, the sudden emptiness where Ranger's bark should have been. Weeks later, someone had placed Ranger's old collar in Ethan's hands and told him there was nothing left to bring home. Ethan had believed them, because grief leaves a man too tired to question the shape of the lie. But now Ranger was here, alive, starved, scarred, shaking in Ethan's arms on the porch of a white farmhouse in Vermont. Ethan pulled back just enough to touch the dog's ribs. His fingers counted them too easily. "Who did this to you?" he whispered. Ranger did not answer, of course, but his body did. He trembled harder when the wind shifted from the north. He turned his head toward the tree line beyond the road, and then, even as his legs nearly gave out, he tried to pull away from Ethan and face the darkness. Not away from home, toward something. Ethan felt it. The old instinct returned like a blade sliding from a sheath. Ranger had not simply come back. Ranger had escaped. And whatever he had escaped from was still out there. Across the road, headlights slowed through the falling snow. Maggie Ellis was driving home from the veterinary clinic with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a paper cup of gas station tea. Maggie was 39, a slender white woman with tired green eyes, chestnut hair usually tied into a messy knot, and the kind of gentle face that made injured animals trust her before people did. She was the only veterinarian in White Pine Hollow, and most folks knew her as patient, soft-spoken, and stubborn in the quiet way that mattered. Life had made her that way. 2 winters earlier, her husband Ben had died when his truck slid off the old bridge near Evergreen Lake. Since then, Maggie had raised their 9-year-old son Owen alone. She smiled for clients, worked late, paid bills in silence, and listened every night when Owen told her things he claimed to have seen near the abandoned Whitlock farm. A chained dog, a red barn, a black truck, men moving in the dark. Maggie had wanted to believe him, but grief could make children imagine monsters. That was what she had told herself. Now, as her headlights swept across Ethan Caldwell's porch, Maggie's foot eased off the gas. She saw Ethan kneeling in the snow. She saw the old green navy jacket. She saw his cane lying beside him. And in his arms, she saw a German shepherd so thin its ribs showed beneath wet fur. Maggie's heart turned cold. The dog looked exactly like the one Owen had drawn again and again. The one behind the red barn. The one nobody believed was real. Maggie pulled to the side of the road, but she did not get out yet. Something about the scene held her still. Ethan was not just helping the dog, he was holding it like a lost family member, like a miracle, like a wound that had walked back through the snow. On the porch, Ethan struggled to lift Ranger. The dog was lighter than he should have been, far too light for a working German shepherd. Ethan carried him inside with both arms, shoulder pushing the door open, boots dragging snow over the threshold. Before the door closed, Ranger lifted his head one more time. His cloudy eyes turned toward the road, toward Maggie's car, toward the dark woods beyond it. Maggie gripped the steering wheel. For the first time in 2 years, she wondered if Owen had not imagined anything. Maybe the monster near the Whitlock farm had been real. Maybe the dog had been real. And maybe somehow that starving German shepherd had finally found the one man who would understand what his scars were trying to say. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan laid Ranger on the rug before the fire. The dog gave one exhausted breath and rested his head against Ethan's boot. Ethan sat beside him on the floor, one hand buried in Ranger's wet fur, the other reaching blindly toward the shelf behind him. His fingers found one of the face-down photographs. He turned it over. He could not see the image, but he knew it by memory. 3 men in desert gear. One German shepherd sitting proudly between them. Luke Bennett laughing. Ethan Caldwell squinting at the sun. Ranger wearing his working harness like he knew he belonged there. Ethan bowed his head. Outside, the storm kept falling, but inside that old white farmhouse, something buried for 3 years had begun to breathe again. And Ethan Caldwell, blind, broken, and forgotten by most of the town, held his lost canine partner beside the fire and whispered the only promise he still knew how to make. "I don't know who hid you from me, boy," he said, "but I'm going to find out." By morning, the storm had stopped, but the world outside Ethan Caldwell's farmhouse looked even quieter than it had during the night. Snow rested on the porch railings in heavy white layers. The road in front of the house had only one set of tire marks, half buried now, where Maggie Ellis had slowed her car and seen something she was not supposed to understand yet. The old white farmhouse stood at the edge of White Pine Hollow with smoke rising from its chimney, warm on the inside, silent on the outside, like it was protecting a secret that had crawled home through the snow. Inside, Ranger had not moved far from Ethan's feet. The German shepherd lay on a thick wool blanket in front of the stove, his body curled in a shape too small for a dog that had once been powerful enough to pull a grown man out of a fire. He was old now, maybe 10 or 11, with a graying muzzle, clouded brown eyes, a torn right ear, and a body so thin that every breath seemed to lift his ribs one by one. His fur should have been thick, black and tan, proud and strong, but it hung in wet clumps over his bones, stained with mud, ice, and old neglect. Even asleep, he kept one paw touching Ethan's boot, as if he feared waking up alone again. Ethan sat in the wooden chair beside him, still wearing the faded dark green military jacket with the worn U.S. Navy SEAL patch on the shoulder. He had not slept. His short dark hair was messy, gray at the temples, and his beard looked rougher in the morning light. Blindness had changed the way people looked at him, but it had not changed the way he held himself. Even exhausted, Ethan sat straight. Even broken, he listened like a man waiting for the first sign of danger. At 8:15, there was a knock at the door. Ranger lifted his head before Ethan moved. The sound that came from the dog was not a bark. It was a low warning, weak but real, vibrating deep in his chest. "It's all right," Ethan whispered, placing one hand on Ranger's shoulder. "I know who it is." Maggie Ellis stepped inside carrying a black medical bag, a folded thermal blanket, and a plastic container of warm broth. She was 39, slender, with chestnut hair tied carelessly at the back of her head, and tired green eyes that always seemed to notice pain before anyone spoke of it. People in White Pine Hollow trusted Maggie because she never talked louder than necessary and never treated animals like property. But grief had shaped her too. Since losing her husband 2 winters earlier, she had become gentler with wounded things and harder toward anyone who lied about how they got hurt. She wiped snow from her boots and paused when she saw Ranger on the blanket. For a moment, the veterinarian in her took over. Her eyes moved quickly over the dog's ribs, hips, paws, ears, and breathing. Then the mother in her appeared, and her face changed. Because she had seen this dog before. Not in person, in crayon, in pencil. In the frightened drawings her son Owen kept hiding under his bed. "Ethan," she said softly, "I need to look at him." Ethan nodded, but his hand stayed on Ranger's fur. He won't like strangers touching him. I know. Maggie lowered herself slowly to the floor, keeping her movements calm. But I am not here to hurt him. Ranger watched her with one clouded eye. He did not growl this time, but his body tightened. Maggie opened the broth first, letting the smell drift toward him before touching him. The dog lifted his head, sniffed, and gave one tired lick at the edge of the bowl. That's good, Maggie said. Small amounts. We cannot rush his stomach. Ethan turned his face toward her voice. How bad? Maggie did not answer right away. That was the first thing that scared him. She put on gloves and began the examination with the careful hands of someone who had delivered calves in barns, stitched hunting dogs after accidents, and held old pets while families cried. Her fingers moved along Ranger's spine. She counted ribs without meaning to. She checked the gums, the eyes, the ears, the pads of his paws. The more she found, the quieter the room became. Malnutrition, she said at last. Severe. Dehydration too, but not as bad as it could be. Someone kept him alive, but barely. Ethan's jaw tightened. Maggie lifted one of Ranger's paws. His nails are worn unevenly. See this? Not from running outside, from pacing on rough concrete or metal. A confined space, probably for a long time. Ranger pulled his paw back and pressed closer to Ethan. It's okay, boy, Ethan murmured, though the words sounded like they were meant for both of them. Maggie moved to the dog's neck. Her expression darkened. Beneath the dirty fur was a deep ring where something had rubbed the skin raw long ago. Not a normal collar, not a leash, a restraint. There was a rope or cable around his neck, she said. Tight. Repeatedly. Ethan closed his eyes, though darkness was already all he had. How old? Some scars are months old, some are older. She checked Ranger's side and found a burn scar near the hip, hidden beneath matted fur. It was not fresh, but it had healed badly, pulled tight at the edges. Then she found the rough line on his abdomen, a crude surgical scar that no proper veterinarian would have left. Maggie breathed through her nose, fighting anger. Someone cut him open once. Not recently. Whoever did it did not care how he healed. Ethan's hand curled into a fist against his knee. The fire popped in the stove. For a moment, the whole house seemed to listen. Maggie shifted closer to Ranger's shoulder. Her fingers paused beneath the thick fur near the upper left side of his back. There was something there. Small. Hard. Not bone. Not scar tissue. She parted the fur carefully. What is it? Ethan asked. Maggie did not answer until she was sure. There is something under the skin. Ethan leaned forward. A chip? Maybe, but not like a pet microchip. It feels bigger, flat, metal. It may be an identification tag or tracking device, but it has been damaged. I can feel an edge under the tissue. Ranger suddenly flinched hard. His head came up, his lips lifted. Maggie froze. Ethan's hand went immediately to the dog's neck. Easy. Easy, Ranger. The name settled into the room like a truth too heavy to lift. Maggie looked at Ethan. So it is him. Ethan did not answer at first. His thumb moved over the torn fold in Ranger's ear. Yes. But you told people your canine died. I did not tell them. Ethan's voice was low. The Navy told me. Maggie sat back slowly. Ethan's face turned toward the fire, but he was not seeing the flames. He was somewhere else, in heat and dust and screaming metal. 3 years ago, there was an explosion. I woke up in a hospital without my sight. Luke Bennett was dead. Ranger was reported dead. They put his collar in my hands and told me there was nothing left. Maggie's expression softened at the name. Sergeant Luke Bennett had never lived in White Pine Hollow, but Ethan had spoken of him once, years ago, before the world closed in. Luke had been 38, tall, broad-chested, with sandy blonde hair, an easy grin, and the kind of loud confidence that made terrified men breathe again. He had been Ethan's closest brother-in-arms, the one who remembered birthdays, wrote letters to widows, and carried extra candy for children in villages where war had stolen everything else. To Ethan, Luke had not just been a teammate. He had been family. "If Ranger is alive," Maggie said carefully, "then someone lied." Ethan's mouth barely moved. "Yes." The word had no anger in it. That made it worse. Maggie continued the examination, but the air in the room had changed. This was no longer only about a starving dog on a porch. It was about a report, a dead soldier, a blind man, and a living witness with scars under his fur. She cleaned the wound marks as gently as she could. Ranger tolerated it only because Ethan stayed beside him. When the antiseptic touched the raw skin at his neck, the old dog shuddered but did not bite. He simply pushed his head into Ethan's lap, trusting the one person he had apparently crossed snow and terror to find. Then Ethan said a name, not loudly, almost to himself. "Grant Mercer signed that report." Ranger changed instantly. The dog's body went rigid, his ears pulled back. A low growl rose from him, deeper than before, frightened and furious at the same time. He tried to stand, but his weak legs slipped on the blanket. Maggie caught the bowl before it tipped. Ethan held Ranger firmly, his face suddenly still. "Ranger," he said. "Easy." But Ranger kept staring toward nothing, shaking as if a ghost had entered the room. Maggie's skin prickled. "Who is Grant Mercer?" Ethan stayed silent long enough that Maggie thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Colonel Grant Mercer, my former commanding officer." He remembered Mercer as a tall, white man in his late 50s, silver hair always perfectly cut, clean-shaven jaw, polished boots, and a voice so controlled it could turn a threat into a compliment. Mercer had been respected by people who liked power and feared by people who understood it. He never shouted. He never needed to. Men obeyed him because he made disobedience feel like stepping off a cliff. "He was the one who told me Ranger was gone," Ethan said. Maggie looked down at Ranger, still trembling at the sound of the name. "That dog remembers him," she said. Ethan's face hardened. "I know." For the first time that morning, Maggie hesitated. She had come to treat an animal, not reopen a military grave. But the dog on the floor had scars that did not come from an accident. And her son had drawn this dog behind an abandoned farm long before it appeared on Ethan's porch. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. Ethan turned toward her. Maggie folded her hands together as if holding herself steady. "My son, Owen, has seen a dog like Ranger before." The room became very still. "Owen is 9, she continued. "Small for his age. Sandy hair, quiet voice. He used to be fearless when his father was alive. After Ben died, he changed. He stopped talking at school. He started drawing instead." Ethan listened without moving. For months, Owen kept drawing a German shepherd chained behind the old Whitlock farm. Same torn ear, same thin body, same red barn in the background. I thought maybe he had imagined it because of grief. His teachers thought the same. The sheriff's office did not take it seriously because Owen was just a grieving child who missed his father. Maggie's eyes lowered. "I wanted to believe him," she said. "But I was afraid believing him would mean something worse was true." Ethan's fingers moved slowly through Ranger's fur. "And now?" "Now I think my son saw Ranger before you did." The old dog gave one exhausted breath and lowered his head again. But he did not sleep. His paw remained fixed against Ethan's boot. Ethan stood. It took effort. Maggie saw it. The sleepless night, the shock, the weight of the truth pressing down on a man who had already carried too much. But he rose anyway and moved toward the hallway cabinet with the exactness of someone who had memorized pain and furniture in equal measure. "What are you doing?" Maggie asked. Ethan opened the lower drawer and reached behind a stack of folded blankets. His hand found a metal box, old and dented, with a small lock that had not been used in years. "I buried Ranger once," he said. "I buried Luke, too, in the only way a man can when he comes home blind and everyone tells him the story is over." He carried the box back to the table and set it down. Inside were the things he had not touched since the funeral. Ranger's old working collar, stiff with age, a small cloth patch from Luke Bennett's uniform, a folded mission map with corners worn from use, and a photograph he could no longer see but knew better than his own reflection. Maggie did not speak. Ethan placed Ranger's old collar on the table. At the sound of the metal tag, Ranger lifted his head. The dog's ears twitched. Then he crawled forward, weak and shaking, and laid his muzzle against the collar like he had found another piece of himself. Ethan bowed his head. The official story had held for 3 years, but now a starving canine had come back from the dead carrying scars no report had mentioned, fear of a colonel no loyal dog should fear, and a connection to a grieving child nobody had believed. Ethan touched the mission map with 2 fingers. Then he whispered, "They did not just lie about you, boy." Ranger looked up at him. Ethan's voice dropped colder. "They lied about everything." By late afternoon, the snow outside Ethan Caldwell's farmhouse had hardened into a pale crust, and the road to town looked like a white scar cut through the pines. Ethan stood near the front door with Ranger beside his left leg, one hand resting on the old dog's head and the other wrapped around the handle of his white cane. He had not asked Maggie Ellis to bring him to her son right away. He had sat for almost an hour after opening the metal memory box, touching Ranger's old collar, Luke Bennett's uniform patch, and the folded mission map as if each object had grown teeth. But silence had never given Ethan answers. So when Maggie finished packing her medical bag, Ethan said, "I need to talk to Owen." Maggie did not answer immediately. She was standing by the kitchen table, her chestnut hair still tied in a loose knot, her green eyes fixed on Ranger. She had spent years protecting injured animals, but protecting her son was different. Owen was not loud. He did not fight. He did not demand to be believed. He simply folded his fear into drawings and hid them where adults would not have to feel guilty for ignoring him. "He gets scared around strangers," Maggie said. "I know," Ethan replied. "I'm not going to push him." Maggie looked at the blind former SEAL in the old green jacket, at the U.S. Navy SEAL patch worn almost smooth on his shoulder, at the scarred dog leaning against him like a returned ghost. She knew Ethan was dangerous in a way quiet men could be dangerous. Not reckless, not angry, worse than that, patient, focused, awake again. "All right," she said, "but if he shuts down, we stop." Ethan nodded once. "We stop." Maggie lived in a small blue house near the north end of White Pine Hollow, close enough to town for the church bell to be heard on clear mornings, but far enough away that the wood still pressed against the backyard. Her home had a narrow porch, a crooked mailbox, and a bird feeder Ben Ellis had built before he died. The paint on the railing had started to peel, but the windows glowed warm, and a snowman with one missing stick arm stood beside the walkway. Owen Ellis was waiting inside at the kitchen table with a pencil in his hand. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with sandy blonde hair that fell over his forehead, and large, gray-blue eyes that made him look younger when he was afraid. He wore a faded red sweatshirt, dark sweatpants, and thick wool socks pulled up unevenly. Before his father's death, Maggie said he had been the kind of boy who ran first and asked questions later, climbing trees, chasing frogs, and talking to every dog that passed their fence. After Ben died on the frozen bridge near Evergreen Lake, Owen had become quiet in a way that made teachers lower their voices around him. He watched doors. He flinched at trucks. He drew things he could not explain. When Ethan stepped inside, Owen barely looked up. Then Ranger came through the doorway. The pencil slipped from Owen's fingers and rolled across the table. For one breath, nobody moved. Ranger stood weakly beside Ethan, his old legs unsteady, his ribs showing through his thin coat, his torn ear angled toward the boy. The dog's cloudy eyes found Owen, and something changed in his tired face. He did not bark. He did not growl. He only took one slow step forward. Owen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then tears filled his eyes so fast it looked painful. "That's him," Owen whispered. Maggie went still beside the door. Ethan turned his head toward the boy's voice. "You know this dog?" Owen shook his head at first, as if his body refused to answer what his heart already knew. Then he nodded. "I heard him." Ranger moved closer to the table. Owen slid from his chair and dropped to his knees on the kitchen floor. Maggie started forward, worried the dog might react badly, but Ranger only lowered his head. Owen reached out with a trembling hand and touched the torn ear. The boy broke. He wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck and sobbed into the dog's wet fur. Ranger stood there, shaking from weakness, and let the child hold him. "I told them," Owen cried. "I told them he was real." Maggie covered her mouth with one hand. Ethan's face tightened, but he did not interrupt. Owen pulled back and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "He was behind the red barn, in the cage. He cried at night, not loud, like he was trying not to get in trouble." Ethan lowered himself carefully into a chair. Ranger stayed between him and Owen, as if the dog understood he belonged to both wounds now. "Who told you he was not real?" Ethan asked. Owen looked at his mother first, not accusing her, just checking if truth was allowed in the room. Maggie knelt beside him. "You can tell him." "My teacher said maybe I dreamed it," Owen said. "Mrs. Carver said sometimes when kids miss someone, they see things that are not there." Mrs. Helen Carver was Owen's fourth-grade teacher, a thin woman in her early 60s with silver-rimmed glasses, careful handwriting, and a habit of treating sadness like a problem that could be organized into folders. She was not cruel, but she believed children were safer when adults softened the truth for them. After Ben's death, she had marked Owen's drawings as grief expression and sent them home with kind notes. Owen swallowed. "Deputy Hale said I should not go near the Whitlock place anyway." Ethan's head turned slightly. "Deputy Hale?" "Not Luke," Maggie said quickly, understanding the name before he asked. "Different man. Curtis Hale, local deputy. Big man, shaved head, always chewing gum. He means well, but he thinks every strange thing in this town is kids trespassing or hunters drinking too much." Ethan stored the name away without comment. Owen stood suddenly and ran down the hall. Maggie started after him, but Ethan lifted one hand. "Let him bring what he wants to show." A drawer opened somewhere in the back room, paper scraped against wood. When Owen returned, he carried a stack of drawings pressed against his chest as if someone might snatch them away. He placed them carefully on the kitchen table. Ethan could not see them, so Maggie described each one aloud. The first showed a thin German shepherd inside a metal cage behind a red barn. The cage had thick black bars. A chain ran from the dog's neck to a post. In the corner, Owen had drawn a frozen water bowl. The second drawing showed a black truck without license plates parked near the same barn. The truck was large, with dark windows and heavy tires. On the side door, Owen had drawn a silver eagle with its wings spread wide. The third showed wooden crates being carried by 2 men. The crates had the same eagle marking. One man wore a dark coat, the other had a cap pulled low. The fourth made Maggie stop reading for a second. It showed a man in a military coat standing beside an open cellar door. The man was tall. His hair was colored gray with hard pencil strokes. Across his chin, Owen had drawn a dark line. "A scar?" Ethan asked. Owen nodded. "Right here." He touched his own chin. He talked soft. That was worse than yelling. Ethan's fingers closed slowly around the edge of the table. Maggie continued, but her voice had changed. The next drawing showed the red barn again, but this time there was a door in the floor, like a hidden hatch. The German shepherd stood near it, head lowered, while the man with the scar pointed toward the dark opening. Ethan said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked, "The silver eagle. Are you sure about it?" Owen nodded hard. "I saw it on the truck. I saw it on the boxes, too." "What kind of eagle?" Ethan asked. Maggie looked at the drawing. "Wings open, head turned to the left. There was a circle behind it." Owen colored the circle gray. Ethan's breath left him slowly. He knew that emblem. Not from White Pine Hollow, not from Vermont. From the last mission. Those crates had come through a supply route that was never supposed to be on the map. The Silver Eagle had been stamped on equipment containers marked as aviation parts, though Luke Bennett had once joked that the boxes were too heavy for anything that flew. Ethan remembered Luke tapping one of the crates and saying, "Something about this feels wrong, brother." 2 days later, the mission went bad. A child could not have invented that symbol. Not this child. Not in this town. "Owen," Ethan said carefully, "did anyone ever tell you to stop drawing these?" Owen lowered his eyes. "A man came to school once." Maggie's head snapped toward him. "What man?" "I didn't know him. He wore a brown coat. He asked Mrs. Carver if I still made pictures about the farm. She said grown-up stuff in the hallway, but I heard my name." Maggie's face drained of color. "You never told me that. I thought I would get in trouble." Ethan's expression turned cold in a way Maggie had not seen before. "You're not in trouble." Owen looked at him. "Was Ranger your dog?" Ethan reached down and touched the old shepherd's head. "Yes." "Did someone steal him?" "I think someone hid him." "Why?" Ethan could have lied. Most adults would have. He could have said they didn't know yet, or that sometimes bad people do bad things for no reason. But Owen had spent months being treated like his fear was childish. Ethan would not add another soft lie to the pile. "Because Ranger knew something they wanted buried," Ethan said. Owen looked down at the dog. "My dad knew too." The room changed. Maggie's hand tightened on the back of a chair. "Owen?" "He did," Owen insisted, but his voice broke. "Dad was scared before he died." Ben Ellis had been 37, broad-shouldered, red-haired, and good-natured in the way men become when they spend their lives fixing things for other people. He had driven delivery trucks, repaired engines, plowed driveways in winter, and sang badly when he thought no one could hear him. Most of White Pine Hollow remembered him as friendly, dependable, and too trusting. Maggie remembered the last months differently. Ben checking the locks twice, Ben answering calls outside, Ben washing mud from his truck at midnight. Owen wiped his face again. He drove boxes for Mr. Whitlock. Not always, just sometimes. He said it was extra money, but then he stopped laughing. Dale Whitlock was not in the room, but his name carried weight. He owned the abandoned farm beyond the pines, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red face, a loud temper, and a reputation for buying broken properties no one else wanted. He smiled at town meetings and cursed at children who crossed his land. Most people avoided him because it was easier than challenging him. "Before the accident," Maggie whispered, then told me something. Ethan turned toward her. Maggie's eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed clear. "He said there was a dog being hidden that should not still be alive. I thought he meant an illegal fighting dog or stolen animal. I asked him to call the sheriff. He said he needed proof first." "What happened after that?" Ethan asked. 3 nights later, his truck went off the old bridge near Evergreen Lake." No one spoke. The old refrigerator hummed in the corner. Ranger leaned against Owen's side. Maggie stood suddenly as if a thought had struck her hard enough to move her body. She went to the mudroom and pulled open a narrow closet. Behind winter boots and a coil of extension cord sat Ben's old metal toolbox, dented blue, rusting at the corners. Maggie had not opened it in months, maybe longer. Some grief could sit in a house like furniture. She carried it to the table. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside were wrenches, receipts, a cracked flashlight, 2 loose bolts, and a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a packet of spare fuses. Maggie unfolded it slowly. On it were 3 lines written in Ben's rough block handwriting. "Evergreen Lake Service Road, North Boathouse Delivery. G.M." Maggie stared at the initials. G.M. She looked at Ethan. "Grant Mercer?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His face had gone still. Too still. He reached out and Maggie placed the paper into his hand. Ethan ran his fingers over it, though he could not read the ink. But he did not need to. Ranger had come back with scars. Owen had drawn the eagle. Ben had died after asking questions. And now, there were initials that matched the one man Ranger feared before the name was even fully spoken. Ethan folded the paper once and set it on the table beside the drawings. Then he turned his blind face toward Maggie and Owen. His voice was quiet, but every word landed like a warning. "If those initials mean what I think they mean," he said, "then your husband did not die because of the ice." The next morning, White Pine Hollow looked peaceful in the way dangerous places sometimes do after a storm. Snow rested clean and bright on rooftops, church steps, parked cars, and the long black road leading out of town. The sky had cleared to a hard winter blue, and the sunlight made every frozen branch shine. To anyone passing through, it might have looked like a postcard town, quiet and safe, where nothing evil could hide behind a barn door. But Ethan Caldwell knew better. Evil did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waited behind locked gates. Sometimes it wore polished boots. Sometimes it signed reports and let grieving men bury empty collars. Ethan stood beside Maggie Ellis's old gray Subaru in front of her house, one hand on his white cane, the other resting on Ranger's head. Ranger had eaten a little broth that morning, enough to stand, but not enough to make him strong. The German shepherd's ribs still showed sharply beneath his dirty black and tan coat. His torn ear hung at an angle. His cloudy eyes looked tired, but every time the wind shifted from the north, his body turned toward the same direction, toward the old Whitlock farm. Maggie watched him from the driver's side. She wore a heavy brown coat over her veterinary scrubs, thick boots, and a knitted gray hat pulled low over her chestnut hair. She looked like a woman who had slept badly and decided fear would not get another vote. Since finding Ben's note in the toolbox, something in her had hardened. Not cruelly. Maggie was not made that way. But the old habit of explaining away Owen's fear had cracked, and underneath it was a mother who wanted answers. "We stay near the public access road," she said. Ethan nodded. We do not force anything. And if someone shows up, we leave. Maggie looked at him. You say that like leaving has ever been easy for you. It is not supposed to be easy, Ethan said. It is supposed to keep us alive. Ranger climbed slowly into the back seat with Maggie's help. The old dog lowered himself onto a folded blanket, but he did not lie down fully. He sat with his muzzle pointed out the window, breathing shallowly, as if he already knew the road. The drive out of town took 15 minutes. They passed the church, the closed feed store, the elementary school where Owen had drawn the same red barn again and again, then the last row of houses before the pine forest swallowed the road. Maggie drove carefully over packed snow and ice. Ethan sat beside her in silence, listening to the tires, the engine, the rattle in the heater vent, the small, anxious breaths from Ranger in the back. You know, Maggie said after a while, Ben used to take this road when he said he had late deliveries. Ethan turned slightly toward her voice. He told me it paid cash, she continued. He said Dale Whitlock was strange, but harmless if you kept your distance. I believed that because I wanted the extra money to mean something simple. Most people believe simple until simple stops making sense, Ethan said. Maggie swallowed and kept driving. The Whitlock farm appeared beyond a bend in the road, half hidden by tall pines and a broken split-rail fence. It had once been a working dairy farm, but that life had died years ago. The farmhouse roof sagged on one side. The windows were boarded. A rusted tractor sat frozen near a shed. The red barn stood farther back, tall and weather-beaten, its paint peeled down to dark wood in places. Snow covered the fields, but the driveway was not untouched. Fresh tire tracks cut through it. Maggie slowed the car. Ranger stood suddenly in the back seat, his claws scraped against the blanket. A low sound came from his chest, not a full growl, more like memory forcing itself through pain. That is the barn from Owen's drawings, Maggie whispered. Ethan did not need to see it. He heard the change in her breathing. He felt Ranger's body tighten behind him. He smelled something faint through the cracked window, old hay, cold metal, diesel oil. Park near the fence, he said. Maggie stopped beside the public shoulder, not crossing the posted line. The wooden sign near the gate read, "Private Property," but the gate itself hung half open, rocking softly in the wind. Ethan stepped out first. His cane touched snow, then gravel beneath it. He waited for the sounds to settle. Pines creaked. A loose piece of tin tapped somewhere ahead. A chain moved lightly in the wind. Metal. Not old wood, not branches. Metal. Ranger came down from the back seat with difficulty. Maggie looped a soft lead loosely through his collar, more for safety than control. Ranger immediately faced the barn, trembling so hard his legs shook. Ethan lowered a hand to him. Easy, boy. The three of them moved along the edge of the fence, staying where the road met the property line. Maggie carried her phone in one hand, camera ready, and the small evidence bag from her clinic in the other. She had no badge, no warrant, no authority, but she had learned from years of veterinary work that details mattered. A hair, a stain, a mark around the neck. The body always kept records, even when people lied. The closer they came to the barn, the more Ranger resisted leaving. He pulled toward a narrow path behind the structure where snow had been disturbed by boots and something heavier dragged across the ground. Maggie looked at Ethan. There are tracks behind the barn. Describe them. Boot prints, 2 sizes, maybe 3. Tire marks too, but not from a farm truck, wider, heavy tread. And there is a drag line in the snow. Ethan tilted his head. The wind struck the side of the barn and brought the smell again. Diesel, old rope, dog fear. That last one was not a smell most people would name, but Ethan knew it. Canine handlers knew when an animal had been forced to stay somewhere it hated. They moved along the fence until they reached a section where the boards had fallen inward. Maggie did not cross, but from where she stood she could see behind the barn clearly enough. Her face changed. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Maggie lifted her phone and began taking pictures. "A chain." Ranger gave a broken whine. The chain lay half-buried in snow beside a post at the rear of the barn. It was thick, rusted in places, newer in others, with a metal clip still attached to the end. Tangled in one link was a small clump of black and tan fur. Maggie crouched near the fence and zoomed in with her phone. "There is fur on it. Shepherd fur." Ethan's grip tightened on his cane. "What else?" "A water bowl. Frozen solid. It is under the overhang near the wall. And there are scratch marks on the lower boards." Ranger tried to step forward. His weak body nearly folded under him. Ethan knelt and caught him. "No. Not yet." The dog pushed his head against Ethan's chest, shaking as if the barn itself were breathing behind them. Maggie moved a few feet along the fence, still staying outside the property line. Something pale and torn fluttered against a strand of wire near a broken post. She reached carefully and lifted it free without stepping through. It was a strip of dark green nylon fabric, stiff from ice and dirt. She held it out. "Ethan." He took it between two fingers. At first, it was just fabric. Then his thumb found the weave. His expression hardened. "This is not from a farm tarp." "What is it?" "Military transport material," he said. "The kind used on equipment bags. Heavy nylon, water-resistant, reinforced edge." Maggie stared at it as if the strip had become heavier in his hand. "Like the crates Owen drew?" "Could be from a bag around those crates. Could be from a cover. But it does not belong here by accident." She took photos of the fabric, then sealed it in the evidence bag. Her hands were steadier now. Anger had a way of steadying people when fear made them shake. Behind them, far down the road, an engine approached. Ranger heard it first. His head snapped up. The sound was low and heavy. Not a small-town pickup with a tired muffler, but something larger, controlled, deliberate. Maggie turned. A black truck came around the bend and slowed beside the open gate. It had no front plate visible through the snow crust. Dark windows, wide tires. The same kind of truck Owen had drawn. The driver's door opened. Dale Whitlock stepped out. He was a thick-bodied white man in his mid-50s with a wide red face, heavy shoulders, and a gray beard trimmed badly along his jaw. He wore a brown work coat, muddy boots, and a black knit cap pulled low over his brow. Everything about him looked rough from the distance, but his eyes were not rough. They were small, sharp, and mean in a calculating way. Dale was the kind of man who played loud and stupid so people would not notice when he was careful. "Well," Dale called, his voice carrying across the snow, "veterinarian, blind man, and a half-dead dog. That sounds like the start of a bad joke." Maggie stood straight. "We are on the public road." Dale smiled without warmth. "Close enough to private property to make me curious." Ethan remained still, one hand on Ranger's head. The dog had begun to growl again, but Ethan kept his palm firm and calm between Ranger's ears. "Your dog seems to know my place," Dale said. Maggie's voice sharpened. "This dog was abused." "Lots of dogs get old. Not my problem." "This chain says otherwise." Dale's eyes flicked toward the back of the barn for half a second. Ethan heard the pause. The silence gave Dale away more than his words did. Dale stepped closer, boots crunching slowly through the snow. "Careful what you accuse people of, Maggie. You have a kid in school and a clinic that depends on locals not thinking you are crazy." Maggie went pale, but she did not step back. Ethan turned his blind face toward Dale. "You should stop talking." Dale laughed. "And you should stop walking around places you cannot see." Ranger lunged half a step. Ethan caught him instantly. Dale leaned slightly toward Ethan, enjoying himself now. The blind man should not go looking for things he cannot see. The words hung in the frozen air. Maggie looked at Ethan, expecting anger, but Ethan did not give Dale the satisfaction. He only stroked Ranger's head once and said quietly, "I do not need to see a man to know when he is afraid." Dale's smile vanished. For 1 second, the farm went silent again. Then Dale pointed toward Maggie's car. "Leave, both of you. Next time, I call the sheriff." Maggie lifted her phone. "Please do." Dale's jaw tightened. Ethan turned away first, not because he was defeated, because he had what he came for. The chain, the bowl, the tracks, the fabric, Dale's reaction, Ranger's fear. They returned to the Subaru slowly. Ranger stumbled once and Ethan stopped to steady him. Dale watched from the gate, his black truck idling behind him like a warning. As Maggie started the car, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was the elementary school. Her stomach dropped before she answered. Mrs. Carver's voice came through thin and anxious. "Owen was safe," she said quickly, but a man in a brown coat had been seen near the playground after dismissal. He had not spoken to Owen, but Owen had become frightened and refused to leave until another parent walked him inside. Maggie's knuckles turned white around the phone. Ethan heard enough from her silence. "Owen?" he asked. "He is safe," she said, but the words shook. "Someone followed him after school." Dale's truck remained in the rearview mirror, still parked at the gate. Maggie drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Laura Hayes listened without interrupting. She was a compact black woman in her early 40s with close-cropped hair, calm brown eyes, and a voice that could quiet a room without rising. She had taken over the White Pine Hollow Sheriff's Office only a year earlier, after serving in a larger county where politics had taught her that bad men often hid behind clean paperwork. Laura was practical, careful, and not easily impressed by fear. But she had never liked Dale Whitlock. "Whitlock has been on my board for months," she said, looking through Maggie's photos. "Possible illegal storage, suspicious truck activity, complaints that disappear before they become statements." "Disappear how?" Maggie asked. Laura's mouth tightened. "People change their minds, or someone above me tells me there's not enough to pursue." Ethan stood beside Ranger near the office door. "Above you?" Laura looked at him. "County level, sometimes higher." The room grew colder. Maggie handed over the evidence bag with the nylon strip. Laura took it carefully. "I can document this," the sheriff said. "I can increase patrols near the school, but I cannot enter Whitlock's property without more." Ethan nodded. He had expected that. Ranger leaned against his leg, exhausted. Dale Whitlock was cruel. He was involved. He knew too much about Ranger, Owen, and Maggie's fear. But Ethan had heard the hesitation in Dale's voice when the military fabric appeared. He had heard the way Dale threatened like a man protecting someone else's secret, not his own. By the time Maggie drove Ethan and Ranger back to the white farmhouse, the sun had begun to sink behind the pines. The old dog slept in the back seat, body twitching with dreams he had not escaped yet. Ethan sat silently, the strip of military fabric still present in his mind like a flare in the dark. Dale Whitlock had not built this lie. He was only guarding one door of it. And somewhere behind that door, the truth about Ranger, Luke Bennett, Ben Ellis, and Colonel Grant Mercer was still waiting. The next morning, White Pine Hollow looked peaceful in the way dangerous places sometimes do after a storm. Snow rested clean and bright on rooftops, church steps, parked cars, and the long black road leading out of town. The sky had cleared to a hard winter blue, and the sunlight made every frozen branch shine. To anyone passing through, it might have looked like a postcard town, quiet and safe, where nothing evil could hide behind a barn door. But Ethan Caldwell knew better. Evil did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waited behind locked gates. Sometimes it wore polished boots. Sometimes it signed reports and let grieving men bury empty collars. Ethan stood beside Maggie Ellis's old gray Subaru in front of her house, one hand on his white cane, the other resting on Ranger's head. Ranger had eaten a little broth that morning, enough to stand, but not enough to make him strong. The German shepherd's ribs still showed sharply beneath his dirty black and tan coat. His torn ear hung at an angle. His cloudy eyes looked tired, but every time the wind shifted from the north, his body turned toward the same direction, toward the old Whitlock farm. Maggie watched him from the driver's side. She wore a heavy brown coat over her veterinary scrubs, thick boots, and a knitted gray hat pulled low over her chestnut hair. She looked like a woman who had slept badly and decided fear would not get another vote. Since finding Ben's note in the toolbox, something in her had hardened. Not cruelly. Maggie was not made that way. But the old habit of explaining away Owen's fear had cracked, and underneath it was a mother who wanted answers. "We stay near the public access road," she said. Ethan nodded. "We do not force anything. And if someone shows up, we leave." Maggie looked at him. "You say that like leaving has ever been easy for you." "It is not supposed to be easy," Ethan said. "It is supposed to keep us alive." Ranger climbed slowly into the back seat with Maggie's help. The old dog lowered himself onto a folded blanket, but he did not lie down fully. He sat with his muzzle pointed out the window, breathing shallowly, as if he already knew the road. The drive out of town took 15 minutes. They passed the church, the closed feed store, the elementary school where Owen had drawn the same red barn again and again. Then the last row of houses before the pine forest swallowed the road. Maggie drove carefully over packed snow and ice. Ethan sat beside her in silence, listening to the tires, the engine, the rattle in the heater vent, the small anxious breaths from Ranger in the back. "You know," Maggie said after a while, "Ben used to take this road when he said he had late deliveries." Ethan turned slightly toward her voice. "He told me it paid cash," she continued. "He said Dale Whitlock was strange, but harmless if you kept your distance. I believed that because I wanted the extra money to mean something simple. Most people believe simple until simple stops making sense," Ethan said. Maggie swallowed and kept driving. The Whitlock farm appeared beyond a bend in the road, half hidden by tall pines and a broken split-rail fence. It had once been a working dairy farm, but that life had died years ago. The farmhouse roof sagged on one side. The windows were boarded. A rusted tractor sat frozen near a shed. The red barn stood farther back, tall and weather-beaten, its paint peeled down to dark wood in places. Snow covered the fields, but the driveway was not untouched. Fresh tire tracks cut through it. Maggie slowed the car. Ranger stood suddenly in the back seat, his claws scraped against the blanket. A low sound came from his chest, not a full growl, more like memory forcing itself through pain. "That is the barn from Owen's drawings," Maggie whispered. Ethan did not need to see it. He heard the change in her breathing. He felt Ranger's body tighten behind him. He smelled something faint through the cracked window. Old hay, cold metal, diesel oil. "Park near the fence," he said. Maggie stopped beside the public shoulder, not crossing the posted line. The wooden sign near the gate read private property, but the gate itself hung half open, rocking softly in the wind. Ethan stepped out first. His cane touched snow, then gravel beneath it. He waited for the sounds to settle. Pines creaked. A loose piece of tin tapped somewhere ahead. A chain moved lightly in the wind. Metal. Not old wood, not branches. Metal. Ranger came down from the back seat with difficulty. Maggie looped a soft lead loosely through his collar, more for safety than control. Ranger immediately faced the barn, trembling so hard his legs shook. Ethan lowered a hand to him. "Easy, boy." The three of them moved along the edge of the fence, staying where the road met the property line. Maggie carried her phone in one hand, camera ready, and a small evidence bag from her clinic in the other. She had no badge, no warrant, no authority, but she had learned from years of veterinary work that details mattered. A hair, a stain, a mark around the neck. The body always kept records, even when people lied. The closer they came to the barn, the more Ranger resisted leaving. He pulled toward a narrow path behind the structure where snow had been disturbed by boots and something heavier dragged across the ground. Maggie looked at Ethan. "There are tracks behind the barn." "Describe them." "Boot prints, 2 sizes, maybe 3. Tire marks too, but not from a farm truck, wider. Heavy tread. And there's a drag line in the snow." Ethan tilted his head. The wind struck the side of the barn and brought the smell again. Diesel, old rope, dog fear. That last one was not a smell most people would name, but Ethan knew it. Canine handlers knew when an animal had been forced to stay somewhere it hated. They moved along the fence until they reached a section where the boards had fallen inward. Maggie did not cross, but from where she stood, she could see behind the barn clearly enough. Her face changed. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Maggie lifted her phone and began taking pictures. "A chain." Ranger gave a broken whine. The chain lay half buried in snow beside a post at the rear of the barn. It was thick, rusted in places, newer in others, with a metal clip still attached to the end. Tangled in one link was a small clump of black and tan fur. Maggie crouched near the fence and zoomed in with her phone. "There's fur on it. Shepherd fur." Ethan's grip tightened on his cane. "What else?" "A water bowl. Frozen solid. It's under the overhang near the wall. And there are scratch marks on the lower boards." Ranger tried to step forward, his weak body nearly folded under him. Ethan knelt and caught him. "No, not yet." The dog pushed his head against Ethan's chest, shaking as if the barn itself were breathing behind them. Maggie moved a few feet along the fence, still staying outside the property line. Something pale and torn fluttered against a strand of wire near a broken post. She reached carefully and lifted it free without stepping through. It was a strip of dark green nylon fabric, stiff from ice and dirt. She held it out. "Ethan?" He took it between 2 fingers. At first it was just fabric. Then his thumb found the weave. His expression hardened. "This is not from a farm tarp." "What is it?" "Military transport material," he said. "The kind used on equipment bags. Heavy nylon, water-resistant, reinforced edge." Maggie stared at it as if the strip had become heavier in his hand. "Like the crates Owen drew?" "Could be from a bag around those crates. Could be from a cover. But it does not belong here by accident." She took photos of the fabric, then sealed it in the evidence bag. Her hands were steadier now. Anger had a way of steadying people when fear made them shake. Behind them, far down the road, an engine approached. Ranger heard it first. His head snapped up. The sound was low and heavy, not a small-town pickup with a tired muffler, but something larger, controlled, deliberate. Maggie turned. A black truck came around the bend and slowed beside the open gate. It had no front plate visible through the snow crust. Dark windows, wide tires. The same kind of truck Owen had drawn. The driver's door opened. Dale Whitlock stepped out. He was a thick-bodied white man in his mid-50s with a wide red face, heavy shoulders, and a gray beard trimmed badly along his jaw. He wore a brown work coat, muddy boots, and a black knit cap pulled low over his brow. Everything about him looked rough from a distance, but his eyes were not rough. They were small, sharp, and mean in a calculating way. Dale was the kind of man who played loud and stupid so people would not notice when he was careful. "Well," Dale called, his voice carrying across the snow, "veterinarian, blind man, and a half-dead dog. That sounds like the start of a bad joke." Maggie stood straight. "We are on the public road." Dale smiled without warmth. "Close enough to private property to make me curious." Ethan remained still, one hand on Ranger's head. The dog had begun to growl again, but Ethan kept his palm firm and calm between Ranger's ears. "Your dog seems to know my place," Dale said. Maggie's voice sharpened. "This dog was abused." "Lots of dogs get old. Not my problem." "This chain says otherwise." Sheriff Laura Hayes did not come to Ethan Caldwell's farmhouse in uniform that morning. She came in a plain dark coat, snow boots, and a wool cap pulled low over her close-cropped hair, driving an unmarked county SUV with salt stains along both doors. Laura was not the kind of sheriff who enjoyed drama. She was compact, steady, and careful with every word, the kind of woman who had learned that truth did not matter unless it could survive paperwork, pressure, and a courtroom. That was why she had not rushed into Dale Whitlock's farm the day before, no matter how badly Maggie wanted her to. A chain behind a barn, a frightened child, and a starving dog were enough to make Laura angry. They were not enough to make a judge sign a warrant. But they were enough to make her start looking. Ethan stood on the porch with Ranger beside him. The old German shepherd looked weaker in daylight, but more awake. His ribs still showed beneath his thin black and tan coat. His torn ear twitched at every sound. His cloudy eyes kept searching the tree line, as if the woods still held the shape of the cage he had escaped from. Maggie had wrapped a clean bandage around the raw groove on his neck, and Ethan had tied a loose working lead to Ranger's collar, not to control him, but to stay connected to him. Maggie arrived a few minutes later with Ben's folded note in a plastic sleeve. She looked different from the day before. Still tired, still pale, still wearing her brown winter coat and veterinary boots, but there was a quiet force in her now, the kind that came after a mother realized her child had been telling the truth all along, and a widow realized her husband might not have died by accident. Laura spread a local map across Ethan's kitchen table, then wrote Evergreen Lake Service Road and North Boathouse Delivery, she said. There are 3 ways to reach that side of the lake. 1 private, 2 public. We use the public route. We do not cross locked property. We do not break anything. We do not open anything that is clearly secured unless there is an immediate danger. Maggie looked at her. And if we find something? Laura tapped the map once. Then I document it properly. Photos, location, chain of custody. Enough to go to Judge Harland before anyone can bury it. Judge Thomas Harland was a retired-looking man in his late 60s with white hair, wire glasses, and a reputation for being slow but fair. People in White Pine Hollow called him stubborn, which Laura considered a compliment. He would not sign a warrant because a sheriff had a feeling, but he would sign one if the evidence stood on its own. Ethan listened to the paper shifting beneath Laura's fingers. He did not need to see the map. The name Evergreen Lake had already found an old place in his mind. Ben Ellis's truck had gone through the guardrail near that lake 2 winters earlier. Owen had drawn a black truck near a red barn. Ranger had trembled at the smell of Whitlock's property. And now Ben's note pointed to the same frozen water where a man had supposedly lost control on ice. The drive to Evergreen Lake was quiet. Laura drove first. Maggie followed with Ethan in the passenger seat, and Ranger stretched across the back, his head lifted despite exhaustion. The road narrowed after the last mailbox in town, winding through pine forest and old stone walls half buried in snow. Maggie kept both hands on the wheel, her eyes fixed ahead. She had driven this way only twice since Ben died, and both times she had turned back before reaching the bridge. Today, she did not turn back. Evergreen Lake appeared through the trees as a flat white silence. In summer, the lake was wide and dark green, with fishing boats, children on docks, and dragonflies over the reeds. In winter, it became something else entirely. Frozen, empty, watchful. Snow covered most of the ice, but here and there dark cracks showed beneath the surface like veins under skin. Near the north shore stood a small boathouse, its roof sagging under snow, its walls gray with age. A narrow service road ran beside it, partially plowed, though nobody should have needed to use it in weeks. Laura parked near the public fishing access sign. Maggie stopped behind her. Before anyone opened a door, Ranger began to growl. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It came deep from his chest, low and shaking, the sound of an animal recognizing a place where pain had happened. Ethan turned toward the back seat. "Ranger?" The dog stood too quickly and stumbled. Maggie reached back to steady him, but Ranger pushed his muzzle toward the left side of the road, away from the boathouse, toward a cluster of pines near the frozen bank. Laura stepped out first and scanned the area. She carried a small camera, gloves, and evidence envelopes. "Public land up to the tree line," she said. "Stay close." The wind coming off the lake cut through every layer of clothing. Ethan moved slowly with his cane, one tap at a time, while Ranger pulled gently at the lead. Not wild, not confused. Focused. Maggie walked at Ethan's right side, ready to catch him if the snow hit a dip in the ground. Laura followed their tracks, photographing the service road, the tire marks, and the old boathouse from several angles. Ranger led them to a large pine tree leaning toward the lake. At first, there was nothing there but snow. Then the dog pawed weakly at the base of the trunk. Maggie knelt. "He found something." Laura crouched beside her and brushed snow away with gloved hands. Beneath the top layer was a patch of disturbed earth, frozen hard but not natural. Someone had covered it carefully, then winter had hidden the rest. Laura used a small folding tool from her kit, not digging wildly, just loosening the ice enough to expose a corner of metal. A box. Old, gray, about the size of a lunch pail. Maggie stopped breathing. Laura photographed it before touching it, then carefully lifted it free. The lid was dented, sealed with a strip of cracked tape. There was no lock, no name, no official marking. "On public access land," Laura said quietly, mostly to herself. "Partially buried. No lock. Documented." She opened it. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The first item was a military identification tag, but the serial number had been ground down almost smooth. Only a few partial digits remained. The second was a short length of military-grade binding cord, the same kind used for securing equipment loads. The third was a black USB drive sealed inside a waterproof bag. Maggie made a sound that was almost a gasp. She reached toward the bag, then stopped herself because Laura had not cleared it. "What?" Ethan asked. Maggie's voice shook. "The bag." Laura held it up. "You recognize it?" "It was Ben's." Maggie swallowed hard. "He used those waterproof pouches for receipts and delivery slips. I bought him a pack for Christmas because he kept ruining paperwork in the snow." Laura's expression changed, but her hands stayed professional. "You are sure?" Maggie nodded. "There was a blue thread tied to the zipper. I did that because he kept losing them in his truck." The blue thread was still there, faded but visible. For a few seconds, Maggie was no longer standing beside a frozen lake with a sheriff and a blind former SEAL. She was back in her kitchen 2 winters ago, laughing at Ben because he had dropped invoices into a puddle again. She could see his red hair, his big hands, his crooked smile, the way he promised every problem was fixable if you had duct tape and patience. Then she saw his truck under the ice. She turned away, pressing one hand over her mouth. Ethan did not reach for her. He simply stood there, giving her space, the way grief sometimes needed space more than comfort. Laura sealed the items individually and took more photos. "We need to view the drive somewhere secure." They did not go to the sheriff's office. Laura chose Ethan's farmhouse because it was away from town, away from curious deputies, and away from the county network she did not entirely trust. Maggie brought an old laptop from her clinic. It was slow, scratched, and usually used for invoices, but it had no connection to county systems. Laura inserted the USB only after photographing it from every side. There were 5 video files, all short, all from a dashboard camera. The first showed a winter road at night, windshield wipers pushing snow aside. Ben's voice could be heard breathing heavily, though he did not speak. Ahead, a black truck turned onto the Evergreen Lake Service Road. The second video showed the same black truck parked near the North Boathouse. Dale Whitlock stepped out, heavy-bodied and red-faced, wearing the same brown work coat Maggie and Ethan had seen the day before. He spoke to someone off-camera, then opened the back of the truck. Wooden crates were visible inside. The third video made Ethan lean forward. Maggie described what she saw because Ethan could not. "A man in a military coat," she whispered. "Tall, gray hair. He is standing near Dale. His face is turned partly away." The man stepped closer to the truck headlights. Maggie stopped. Laura's jaw tightened. Ethan asked, "Scar?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Across the chin." The fourth video had sound. The camera was farther away, maybe hidden inside Ben's parked truck. Wind made the audio rough, but the voices were clear enough. Dale said, "The dog is getting worse." Then another voice answered, controlled, smooth, older. "Keep it alive until I say otherwise." Ethan's face went pale. He knew that voice. Colonel Grant Mercer. In Ethan's memory, Mercer was always polished and certain. Silver hair, clean jaw except for the old scar across his chin, dark eyes that made men stand straighter, and a voice so calm it could make cruelty sound like procedure. Ethan had trusted that voice once. He had followed it into fire. He had believed it when it told him Ranger was dead. Now that same voice came from Ben Ellis's hidden video, ordering Dale Whitlock to keep Ranger alive. The fifth video was the shortest. Ben's breathing was louder. The camera shook. A crate passed close enough to show the silver eagle emblem Owen had drawn. Then Ben whispered, "Maggie, if something happens, it was not the ice." The video ended. No one moved. Maggie stared at the screen as if Ben might come back if she waited long enough. Laura removed the USB and sealed it. "This is enough to go to Judge Harland." Ethan's hand rested on Ranger's back. The old dog had lowered himself beside the stove, but his eyes remained open. "They kept Ranger because he was proof," Ethan said. "A living piece of the mission they could not explain." Laura looked at him. "And Ben found him." Maggie's voice was hollow. "So they killed my husband and called it an accident." Laura did not soften it with false comfort. "We are going to reopen that case." Before she could say more, Maggie's phone rang. The screen showed White Pine Elementary. Maggie answered quickly. Her face changed before the first sentence was finished. "What do you mean he never got on the bus?" Ethan stood. Ranger lifted his head. Laura stepped closer. Maggie's voice rose, thin with panic. "He was supposed to wait inside. I told Mrs. Carver he was not to leave alone." The person on the other end spoke rapidly. Maggie closed her eyes, listening, then whispered, "Check his desk." Minutes later, another call came. This time it was Mrs. Carver herself, crying. Owen's backpack was still in the classroom. His coat was gone. On his desk was a new drawing, left flat in the open where someone would find it. Maggie put the phone on speaker with shaking hands. Mrs. Carver described it through tears. Ranger standing before a cellar door beneath the red barn, a black truck outside, and beside the door, a tall man with gray hair and a scar across his chin. Ethan did not need anyone to say the name. He already knew. Colonel Grant Mercer had stopped hiding behind old reports, and now Owen was gone. Dale's eyes flicked toward the back of the barn for half a second. Ethan heard the pause. The silence gave Dale away more than his words did. Dale stepped closer, boots crunching slowly through the snow. "Careful what you accuse people of, Maggie. You have a kid in school and a clinic that depends on locals not thinking you are crazy." Maggie went pale, but she did not step back. Ethan turned his blind face toward Dale. "You should stop talking." Dale laughed. "And you should stop walking around places you cannot see." Ranger lunged half a step. Ethan caught him instantly. Dale leaned slightly toward Ethan, enjoying himself now. "A blind man should not go looking for things he cannot see." The words hung in the frozen air. Maggie looked at Ethan expecting anger, but Ethan did not give Dale the satisfaction. He only stroked Ranger's head once and said quietly, "I do not need to see a man to know when he is afraid." Dale's smile vanished. For 1 second, the farm went silent again. Then Dale pointed toward Maggie's car. "Leave, both of you. Next time, I call the sheriff." Maggie lifted her phone. "Please do." Dale's jaw tightened. Ethan turned away first, not because he was defeated, because he had what he came for. The chain, the bowl, the tracks, the fabric. Dale's reaction. Ranger's fear. They returned to the Subaru slowly. Ranger stumbled once, and Ethan stopped to steady him. Dale watched from the gate, his black truck idling behind him like a warning. As Maggie started the car, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was the elementary school. Her stomach dropped before she answered. Mrs. Carver's voice came through, thin and anxious. "Owen was safe," she said quickly, but a man in a brown coat had been seen near the playground after dismissal. He had not spoken to Owen, but Owen had become frightened and refused to leave until another parent walked him inside. Maggie's knuckles turned white around the phone. Ethan heard enough from her silence. "Owen?" he asked. "He is safe," she said, but the words shook. "Someone followed him after school." Dale's truck remained in the rearview mirror, still parked at the gate. Maggie drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Laura Hayes listened without interrupting. She was a compact black woman in her early 40s with close-cropped hair, calm brown eyes, and a voice that could quiet a room without rising. She had taken over the White Pine Hollow Sheriff's Office only a year earlier, after serving in a larger county where politics had taught her that bad men often hid behind clean paperwork. Laura was practical, careful, and not easily impressed by fear. But she had never liked Dale Whitlock. "Whitlock has been on my board for months," she said, looking through Maggie's photos. Possible illegal storage, suspicious truck activity, complaints that disappear before they become statements. "Disappear how?" Maggie asked. Laura's mouth tightened. "People change their minds. Or someone above me tells me there is not enough to pursue." Ethan stood beside Ranger near the office door. "Above you?" Laura looked at him. "County level, sometimes higher." The room grew colder. Maggie handed over the evidence bag with the nylon strip. Laura took it carefully. "I can document this," the sheriff said. "I can increase patrols near the school, but I cannot enter Whitlock's property without more." Ethan nodded. He had expected that. Ranger leaned against his leg, exhausted. Dale Whitlock was cruel. He was involved. He knew too much about Ranger, Owen, and Maggie's fear. But Ethan had heard the hesitation in Dale's voice when the military fabric appeared. He had heard the way Dale threatened, like a man protecting someone else's secret, not his own. By the time Maggie drove Ethan and Ranger back to the white farmhouse, the sun had begun to sink behind the pines. The old dog slept in the back seat, body twitching with dreams he had not escaped yet. Ethan sat silently, the strip of military fabric still present in his mind like a flare in the dark. Dale Whitlock had not built this lie. He was only guarding one door of it. And somewhere behind that door, the truth about Ranger, Luke Bennett, Ben Ellis, and Colonel Grant Mercer was still waiting. By the time Maggie Ellis ran out of Ethan Caldwell's farmhouse with Owen's glove clutched in one hand, the sky over White Pine Hollow had turned the color of ash. The storm came faster than the forecast had promised. Snow crossed the road sideways, covering tire tracks almost as soon as they appeared. The pines behind Ethan's house bent under the wind, and somewhere in town, the church bell rang once, then disappeared beneath the weather. Sheriff Laura Hayes stood beside her unmarked SUV, phone pressed to her ear, her dark coat snapping in the wind. Her calm face had not changed, but her eyes had. They had become sharp and urgent. County backup was at least 40 minutes away because the West Road had iced over near the bridge. The state unit was farther. Judge Harland had not yet signed anything. The evidence from Ben's USB was strong, but legal paper moved slowly, and Owen Ellis was a 9-year-old boy missing in a storm. Laura ended the call and looked at Ethan. "We cannot wait." Maggie's face was white with fear. Her chestnut hair had come loose from her hat, and snow stuck to the wet strands near her cheeks. She was a veterinarian, a widow, a mother, a woman who had spent 2 years telling herself her son's nightmares were only grief. Now every second felt like punishment for not believing sooner. "Ranger can track him," Ethan said. Laura looked at the old German shepherd. Ranger stood near Ethan's left leg, thin body shaking, bandage around his neck, cloudy eyes fixed on the glove in Maggie's hand. He should not have been standing. He should have been beside the fire, eating broth and sleeping through pain. But the moment Owen's name was spoken, something old had returned to his body. Not strength, duty. Maggie knelt in front of him. "He is too weak." Ranger leaned forward and touched his nose to Owen's glove. Then he whined. It was not the frightened sound from the barn. It was a plea. Ethan crouched slowly, one hand on his cane, the other on Ranger's head. "I know, boy." Maggie held out the glove. Ethan took it and placed it beneath Ranger's nose. The dog inhaled once, twice, then lifted his head toward the north road, toward the pines, toward the Whitlock farm. Laura opened the back of her SUV and pulled out a flashlight, a radio, and a medical blanket. "Maggie, ride with me. Ethan, you and Ranger in the back. We go as far as the service road allows. If the truck cannot make it, we walk." The drive became a blur of white. Snow hammered the windshield so hard the wipers could barely clear it. Maggie sat rigid in the passenger seat, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping Owen's glove as if it were still attached to him. Ethan sat in the back with Ranger's head in his lap. He could not see the storm, but he heard it. Snow striking glass, tires slipping once, correcting, Laura breathing evenly through her nose, Maggie whispering Owen's name without realizing it. The road ended before the farm. A fallen pine blocked the final stretch. Laura braked hard. "We walk from here." Deputy Curtis Hale's patrol vehicle arrived behind them a minute later, lights muted by the storm. Curtis Hale was a big white man in his late 30s with a shaved head, a square jaw, and the habit of chewing gum even when fear had dried his mouth. He had dismissed Owen's drawings once, thinking he was protecting the boy from his own imagination. Now guilt had made him move faster than orders. With him was Deputy Erin Cole, a lean young woman in her late 20s with dark braided hair, watchful eyes, and a quiet discipline that made her look older than she was. Laura gave them short instructions. No sirens, no shouting unless necessary. The child may be inside. Dale Whitlock and Colonel Mercer may be armed. We move behind Ranger, not ahead of him. Curtis looked at Ethan, then at the dog. That dog can do this? Ethan's voice was flat. He already has. Ranger took the scent again and moved into the trees. The old dog did not run. He could not. He moved, step by step, head low, nose cutting through snow and wind. Ethan followed with his cane tapping into hidden roots, buried stones, and icy ground. Maggie stayed close enough to steady him, though he rarely needed it. Laura moved behind them with her flashlight low. The deputies followed in a wider line, shadows passing between pine trunks. The forest seemed endless. Every sound was swallowed by snow. Then Ranger stopped. Ahead through the trees, the red barn appeared. No lights showed from the front, but behind it, near the old loading door, a black truck sat half-hidden beneath falling snow. Its engine was off. Heat still rose faintly from the hood. Laura raised one hand. Everyone froze. Ranger pulled toward the rear of the barn, not the front entrance. Ethan felt the lead tighten and whispered, "Slow." They reached the back wall where the overhang sagged under snow. The chain they had photographed earlier was gone. The frozen water bowl had been kicked aside. Fresh boot prints led to a narrow rear door hidden beneath a sheet of loose tin. Laura tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the barn smelled of damp wood, diesel, old hay, and fear. Ranger entered first. The floorboards creaked under human weight, but barely under his. Ethan stepped in behind him, cane moving carefully. Maggie kept one hand on Ethan's sleeve, her eyes searching the dark. Laura's flashlight moved across stacked crates, tire tracks in dust, an old workbench, and ropes hanging from wall hooks. Then Ranger went straight to the center of the floor. He pawed at a wide plank. Maggie's breath caught. The drawing. Laura knelt and brushed straw away. There was a metal ring set into the wood, nearly hidden beneath dirt. A hatch. Curtis and Aaron moved forward. Laura lifted the ring and pulled. The hatch opened with a groan, releasing cold air from below. A small voice cried out from the darkness. "Mom?" Maggie almost fell to her knees. "Owen!" Owen Ellis was curled at the bottom of a short wooden ladder in a narrow cellar room. His red sweatshirt was torn at one sleeve. His face was pale, his sandy hair damp with melted snow, and his lips had turned bluish from cold. But he was alive. He was shaking, terrified, and alive. Laura went down first, then Maggie. When Maggie reached him, Owen clung to her so tightly that she could barely breathe. She wrapped him in the medical blanket, kissing his hair, his forehead, his hands, saying his name over and over, like each word pulled him farther from the dark. Ethan stood at the top of the hatch with Ranger pressed against his leg. "Owen," Ethan said gently, "did they hurt you?" Owen looked up from his mother's arms. His eyes were wide and glassy. "They said I saw too much." Laura's voice stayed controlled. "Who said that?" "Mr. Whitlock, and the man with the scar." Owen swallowed hard. "They said they had to move the last shipment before morning. They said the storm would cover the tracks." Maggie held him tighter. Owen looked at Ranger. "He said Ranger had to die this time. He said the dog remembered the way home." Ranger gave a low growl. Then a voice came from the far side of the barn. "Still sentimental, Caldwell?" Everyone turned. Colonel Grant Mercer stepped from the shadows near the loading door. He was tall, silver-haired, and immaculate despite the weather, wearing a dark military-style coat buttoned high at the throat. The scar across his chin looked pale under Laura's flashlight. His face was controlled, almost elegant, but his eyes were hard and empty. Beside him stood Dale Whitlock, thick-bodied, red-faced, breathing heavily, one hand curled around a length of rope like a man too angry to think clearly. Laura raised her weapon. "Hands where I can see them." Mercer lifted his hands slowly, smiling as if the order amused him. "Sheriff, you are standing on private property without a warrant. There is a kidnapped child under your feet," Laura said. Dale snapped. "He broke in." "He is 9!" Maggie shouted. Mercer ignored her. His gaze stayed on Ethan. "You were always difficult to kill cleanly." The barn went silent. Ethan did not move. His blind eyes faced Mercer's voice. "You signed Ranger's death report." "I signed many reports." "You told me Luke died in the blast." Mercer's smile thinned. "Luke Bennett should have stayed loyal." Ranger shook beside Ethan, but Ethan kept one hand on him. Laura stepped forward. "Colonel Mercer, stop talking and get on your knees." Mercer's calm finally cracked. "You have no idea what you walked into." "No," Ethan said quietly. "But Luke did." That name hit harder than any threat. Mercer's breathing changed. Ethan heard it. Fear had a rhythm. Pride tried to hide it, but the body never did. "You killed him because he found the shipments," Ethan said. "Then you staged the explosion. You kept Ranger because he knew the route. Ben Ellis found him later, so you buried that, too." Dale lunged suddenly toward the hatch, reaching for Owen. Ranger moved before anyone else. The old German shepherd threw himself between Dale and the boy, a broken body answering one final command no one had spoken. He hit Dale's arm with all the strength he had left. Dale screamed and stumbled backward as Curtis Hale and Aaron Cole rushed in from the side. Curtis tackled Dale against the workbench. Aaron pinned his wrist and kicked the rope away. Laura moved on Mercer at the same time. He tried to step back, but Ethan's cane struck the floor in front of his boot, stopping him just long enough for Laura to force him down and cuff him. Mercer's polished voice was gone now. Snow blew through a crack in the barn wall. Sirens finally sounded faintly beyond the trees. As Laura pulled him up, Mercer looked toward Ethan with hatred stripped bare. "Luke was going to expose everything," he said. "The roots, the crates, the buyers. He would have ruined men far above me. So yes, he died because he knew too much. And that animal should have died with him." Ethan's face did not change, but his hand lowered toward Ranger. The dog had collapsed beside the hatch. Maggie cried out and reached him first. Ranger's body trembled once, then went still except for the shallow rise of his ribs. Ethan lowered himself beside the dog, finding him by touch, both hands sinking into the scarred fur. Owen crawled out from the cellar wrapped in the blanket, crying silently as he placed one small hand on Ranger's shoulder. Outside, more vehicles arrived through the storm. Inside the red barn, Dale Whitlock lay cuffed in the snow-dusted hay. Colonel Grant Mercer stood in handcuffs beneath Laura's flashlight, and Ethan Caldwell held the dog who had crossed pain, lies, and winter to lead them all back to the truth. Ranger did not die in the red barn. For one terrible hour, Ethan Caldwell believed he might. The old German shepherd lay wrapped in a thermal blanket in the back of Sheriff Laura Hayes's SUV while the storm kept tearing across White Pine Hollow. Maggie Ellis sat beside him, one hand pressed to the bandage around his neck, the other feeling for the weak but steady beat beneath his ribs. Owen sat in the front seat with Laura, wrapped in a deputy's coat, too cold and frightened to speak. Ethan sat on the other side of Ranger, his blind eyes fixed toward nothing, both hands buried in the dog's scarred fur. He could not see the snow. He could not see the flashing lights behind them. He could not see Colonel Grant Mercer being driven away in handcuffs, his polished voice finally useless. But Ethan could feel Ranger breathing, shallow, broken, alive. Maggie kept saying, "Stay with us, boy." Ethan did not say anything. He had made too many promises to the dead. This time, he only listened. At Maggie's clinic, the lights burned all night. The building was small, with pale green walls, old cabinets, and framed pictures of dogs, horses, cats, and children holding muddy puppies. To most of White Pine Hollow, it was just the town veterinary clinic. To Maggie, it had been the place she kept working after Ben died because animals still needed her hands, even when her heart had forgotten how to rest. That night she fought for Ranger like she was fighting for Ben, for Owen, and for every truth she had almost allowed the world to bury. Ranger was dehydrated, exhausted, infected in 2 old wounds, and dangerously weak. Maggie cleaned him, warmed him slowly, started fluids, and sat beside him until dawn. Ethan stayed on the floor outside the treatment room, his back against the wall, his old navy jacket folded across his lap. Owen refused to go home. He curled in a chair under a blanket, staring at the door as if Ranger might vanish if he blinked. Sheriff Laura came near sunrise. She looked older than she had the night before. Her close-cropped hair was damp from melted snow, her brown eyes tired, her uniform creased from hours of work. But her voice was steady. "Mercer is in federal custody," she said. "Dale Whitlock, too. We found crates under the barn floor. Military equipment, records, payment ledgers. Enough names to make a lot of powerful men stop sleeping." Maggie looked up from Owen's chair. "And Ben?" Laura's expression softened. "We reopened the investigation into his death before sunrise. The bridge accident file has been sealed for review. After what was on that USB, no one gets to call it bad weather anymore." Maggie closed her eyes. For 2 years, people had told her grief made her search for meaning where there was none. They said roads iced over, trucks slid, good men died. But now, someone had finally said what her heart had known all along. Dan Ellis had not simply lost control on a bridge. He had tried to carry the truth home. Federal investigators arrived 2 days later. One of them was Special Agent Daniel Ross, a tall black man in his early 50s with a shaved head, calm hands, and the quiet patience of someone who had spent half his life listening to liars. He did not speak quickly. He did not make promises he could not keep. But when Ethan sat across from him in Laura's office and told him about Luke Bennett, Ranger, the mission map, and Colonel Mercer's report, Ross wrote down every word. The truth came out piece by piece. Mercer had used military supply routes to move equipment into private hands. Luke Bennett had discovered irregular crates, false manifests, and names that did not belong on any official mission document. Luke had planned to report it. The explosion that blinded Ethan and killed Luke had not been a tragic battlefield accident. It had been arranged to erase a man who knew too much. Ranger had survived. That was Mercer's mistake. The dog had remembered routes, scents, handlers, voices, and hidden storage sites. Mercer could not explain why a dead canine was alive, so he kept Ranger hidden, moved him from place to place, and finally left him in Dale Whitlock's care when the dog became too old to control. Ben Ellis found Ranger behind the barn, recorded what he could, and hid the USB before his truck went off the frozen bridge. By the end of the week, Colonel Grant Mercer was charged with conspiracy, murder, obstruction, falsifying military reports, trafficking government property, and the kidnapping connected to Owen. Dale Whitlock was charged with kidnapping, animal cruelty, illegal storage, and assisting Mercer's operation. More arrests followed quietly, but Ethan did not care about headlines. He cared about one name: Luke Bennett. 3 weeks after the storm, Ethan received a call from a military review board. A woman named Captain Rebecca Shaw spoke to him. She was a disciplined officer in her 40s with a clear voice, respectful but not sentimental. The kind of person who treated records like lives because she understood they often were. She told Ethan that Luke Bennett's file had been formally corrected. His death was no longer listed as the result of enemy action caused by operational confusion. His record now stated that he had uncovered criminal activity and was killed because he tried to expose it. For a long time, Ethan could not answer. He sat at his kitchen table, one hand on the phone, the other resting on Ranger's head. Ranger was lying beside his chair, thinner than he should be, older than any working dog deserved to feel, but healing. His fur had been cleaned and brushed. His wounds were closing. His eyes were still cloudy, but when Ethan moved, Ranger lifted his head. Every time. Captain Shaw said, "Sergeant Bennett deserved the truth, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan's voice broke when he finally replied, "Yes, ma'am. He did." After that, the white farmhouse changed, slowly. Not all at once. Nothing frozen for 3 years thawed in a day, but Maggie came by often to check Ranger's wounds. Sometimes she brought medical supplies, sometimes soup, sometimes nothing at all except herself. She did not fill the house with forced cheer. Ethan appreciated that. Maggie understood quiet. She understood grief that sat in chairs, waited in hallways, and returned without asking permission. Owen came with her after school. At first he sat on the floor beside Ranger and said nothing. Then he began reading aloud from books about mountain dogs, rescue dogs, and old soldiers' horses. Owen was still small, still watchful, still a boy learning that adults could be wrong and still love him. But each day his voice grew steadier. Ranger listened to every word. Sometimes he slept through entire chapters. Owen did not mind. One afternoon he brought a new drawing. This one had no cage, no red barn, no black truck. It showed Ethan's white farmhouse beneath falling snow. Ethan stood on the porch in his dark green navy jacket, his white cane beside him. Maggie stood near the steps with one hand on Owen's shoulder. Ranger lay at their feet, not chained, not afraid, but home. Owen gave it to Ethan. "I made this one different," he said. Ethan touched the thick paper carefully. "Tell me what it shows." Owen described it. When he finished, Ethan held the drawing against his chest for a moment before setting it on the shelf. Then, for the first time in 3 years, he turned the old framed photographs face up. Luke Bennett, Ranger, the team, the life that had been stolen but not erased. White Pine Hollow held the ceremony on a cold Saturday morning in front of Town Hall. It was not large, no parade, no speeches that tried too hard, just townspeople standing in winter coats, children from Owen's school, Maggie near the front, Sheriff Laura in uniform, and Ethan beside Ranger. The old German Shepherd wore a new leather collar. It had been made by a retired saddlemaker named Harold Price, a thin, elderly man with bent hands, a white mustache, and a reputation for never charging full price when the job mattered. The brass plate on the collar had been polished until it shone. Ethan could not see the crowd rise, but he heard it. One by one, people stood. Boots shifted on snow. Coats rustled. Someone began crying softly. Sheriff Laura stepped forward and read the engraving aloud. "Ranger, the canine who came home." Ethan placed his hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into him. Maggie later opened a small program through her clinic to provide free care for retired working dogs whose handlers could not afford treatment. She named the first fund after Ranger. Sheriff Laura created a local witness protection and support initiative for children who reported danger but were dismissed as frightened or imaginative. Owen was the first child invited to help design the poster, and he drew a dog standing beside a boy under a porch light. None of it fixed everything. Nothing ever did. Ben was still gone. Luke was still gone. Ethan's sight did not return. Ranger would never again be the young canine who ran through dust and fire without fear. But truth had returned. And sometimes truth was the first mercy God allowed before healing began. On a quiet afternoon, weeks later, snow fell gently over the white farmhouse. Ethan sat on the porch in his old Navy jacket, the U.S. Navy SEAL patch worn but visible on his shoulder. His white cane leaned against the chair. Ranger lay at his feet on a thick blanket, breathing softly. Maggie and Owen walked up the path carrying a warm pie wrapped in a towel. Owen called, "We brought dessert." Ethan smiled before he answered. Not the small, polite smile people gave strangers. A real one. The kind that made Maggie stop for half a second because she realized she had never seen it before. Ranger lifted his head, gave one tired wag of his tail, and rested his muzzle back on Ethan's boot. The dog had not come home only to be saved. He had come home to save a boy, clear a dead man's name, expose a powerful lie, and bring a blind soldier back from the cold place where grief had left him. And inside the old white farmhouse, beside the fire, Ranger finally slept without fear. Most people might have heard scratching outside their porch and waited for the storm to pass. Some might have opened the door, seen a starving dog, and called someone else to handle it. But Ethan Caldwell did not turn away, because Ranger was still breathing. Owen still needed to be found. Maggie still needed the truth about Ben, and somewhere beneath years of lies, Luke Bennett's name still needed someone brave enough to bring it back into the light. That kind of loyalty does not ask for applause. It crawls through snow, scarred and starving, until it reaches the one heart that will recognize it. Tonight, I pray God blesses your home, protects the people you love, heals the pain you carry in silence, and gives you the courage to believe the wounded when they are trying to show you the truth. If Ethan and Ranger's story touched your heart, write Amen in the comments. And if you believe in loyalty, faith, justice, and second chances, subscribe and stay with us. But Ranger's story was not the last time a forgotten canine came back from the dead to expose a buried secret. Wait until I tell you about the retired Marine who found a starving German shepherd locked inside an abandoned police cruiser during a midnight storm. That story involves a missing handler, a burned evidence box, and a dog who refused to leave one frozen roadside until the truth under that wreck finally came out. And trust me, when the Marine opened the back door and saw what the dog was guarding, even the officers on scene could not speak. Subscribe now, because this next story is one you definitely do not want to miss.